Thanks very much. Thank you. And thanks very much to everybody for coming today and to Caresoft for this great event. I'm going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves because they have some extraordinary background in this space as we've looked at cybersecurity across the board from a defense perspective as well as civilian, but importantly, the intersection of private and government. So I'll start with you, Vicki, if you could just give us a little bit of your background.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My background is I have 22 years in the Air Force as a career Air Force officer, retired, and then I went to work for DoD in the CIO's office. And I've been there for a little over 10 years now, so I've seen quite a lot of change since the time that I've been there. But I've been in the area of cybersecurity this entire time. And my current job, I am the Director of Cybersecurity Policy and Partnerships. I do things that have to do with the cybersecurity strategies in the department, as well as the policies and our outreach to our international partners. And last but not least, I'm the director of the DIB Cybersecurity Program, and it's a voluntary public-private partnership between DoD and defense industry for the purpose of sharing cyber threat information. So I've got a long, quite a lengthy amount of things that are in my portfolio. I have a great staff and a lot of people that are working very hard to really raise the bar in cybersecurity across the department and in the federal space and the defense industrial base.
Thank you.
I'm Colonel Leslie Zyzda-Martin.
You should tell everybody your call sign.
My call sign's Otis, so
might be easier.
Yeah, it's so much easier. So I work in intelligence, so I'm an intelligence professional, but cyber is my avenue of doing my job. So that's why I'm here. I am a member of the National Guard, full-time active duty. So active duty, just like my tape says, I'm Air Force, but I'm also National Guard, and that's key here. Because I've got two big missions, and everyone understands what the Air Force does to defend the nation outside of the borders. But as a National Guard member, I have to defend the nation here. And that doesn't mean defend just from attacks, but it also means domestic operations. So in the environment I work in over here, and I'll probably spend most of the time today talking about this environment because there's a lot of classified stuff going on, and I think a lot of you already know the environment I'm in on the Title 10 side, but on my Title 32 side, we really struggle with supporting our states during hurricanes. California has fires right now. I'm dealing with my customer who is the EMS, or during Hurricane Harvey, the Cajun Navy, who could be felons, that I'm working on a network that is not a DOTN. I need to be able to support my folks on that network or on that unclassified network and still remain secure. Because some of the skills I bring to bear and our cyber professionals, our intelligence professionals, and even our operational professionals bring to bear, we may have to push that information over the dirty internet, and that's going to tell the enemy, if anyone's looking at us, how we operate on this side of the world. So to save lives, we will do our job, but we don't want to break what we do over here. So that's why I'm here today, and that's the struggle we have operating in this avenue.
Thank you, Colonel, and I want to get into your authorities in a moment, but let's start off with sort of a broader look at the conversation, because I think based on both of your backgrounds and experience, you have seen the threat evolve, and you're very familiar with the agility of the threat, and based on where you each sit, I'll start with you, Vicki. What do you see as the greatest threats from your position? Because with your intersection of military, defense, industry, et cetera.
So greatest threat is there are many threats to both the DoD's networks and our capabilities, and also in our defense industrial base. I think that's where I'd like to focus, is on the defense industrial base. We rely on the DIB, if you will, to develop our capabilities, our warfighting capabilities. DoD doesn't go out and build planes. We contract with many of our partners in the industry to build those capabilities. And what we found over the years is that cybersecurity hasn't always been a priority. For many years, we didn't think about it, right? And it was something that all of a sudden we became aware of when we started to see a significant amount of exfiltration of data that had to do with our weapon systems from our defense contractors. So we've spent about the last 10 years really working hard with the defense industrial base to, first of all, establish cybersecurity requirements for the DIB on their own internal information systems where that information is being developed, where that intellectual property is stored. And also helping them understand that there are significant threats against them and that our adversaries are in fact targeting them to steal the capabilities that the DoD is developing. So over time, the evolution of that, we know that our very large primes especially have a lot of investments now into the cybersecurity area, and they're really working hard to shore up all of their defenses, and they have a lot of capability that they maybe didn't have several years ago. So what that does is it doesn't mean the adversary stops targeting. What they do is they work their way down the supply chain, and they look for the weakest link. They look for the places where the resources don't exist or that capability isn't there, and where it's easy to go in, steal the data, and find those weak links. So that is our real challenge here, is not only making sure that our large, big, capable companies have the resources they need to protect the intellectual property, but as that information flows down the supply chain, that it is also protected. And then the little added twist on that, of course, is the whole thing about supply chain integrity, and are the parts that you're getting not counterfeit? Is the software you're getting pure and developed in a capable way, and those kinds of things. So those are things that we all have to think about in the defense industrial base.
One follow-up before I go to the Colonel. One of the things that the primary reason that we're focused on at the Cyber Readiness Institute is a follow-on to the commission in 2016 on security, specifically looking at small business cybersecurity. And as you look at the exfiltration of data, and to your point, the supply chain integrity, how are you working and engaging with small businesses? Because the requirements that you have for the larger companies, they don't always know where their touch points are and their access points. And your point about the weakest link is obviously it's critical to all of this.
Well, it all starts with standards. So we rely on the NIST standards, and we point our contractors to be compliant with the NIST standards, and we do that through contracting. So we put it right up front in the contract that you will protect our information and this information systems where that information will reside, and we're going to we'll lay out what those standards are. Most of our defense industrial base at this point is required to implement NIST 800-171, which was written for non-federal information systems. And there was a whole lot of work done at NIST to look at what are all the requirements that the federal government has, basically taking the catalog of controls in 853, pulling out those things that meet the moderate baseline for security, and then taking that and writing it in terms where it's more performance-based so that the defense industry can figure out what their solutions need to be, rather than the prescriptive nature that we use for the federal government, where it says, thou shalt use a CAC for multi-factor authentication. Instead, we say, please have multi-factor authentication for access to your local network. You figure out what that solution is that works. So it all comes down to standards and communicating those standards in contracts so that they're now held accountable.
How easy do you think it is, though, for small businesses to follow those standards from a compliance-based approach versus a risk-based approach because of the complexities of them?
Well, it can be a challenge. However, there are a lot of really great resources out there for small business. There are the PTACs, and I forget what exactly they stand for, but it'll come to me, and the Manufacturing Extension Partnership programs out there that are free services basically to small business. And then there are some free tools along the way. So there's a lot of resources that are available to small business, and that's where I would point them to. Is if you're not sure exactly how to get started, the first thing to do is read your contracts, know what your requirements are, read the publications that we're telling you what those standards are. And then from there, and there's another one, there's a NIST MEP handbook 162 actually talks them through how to get from no implementation at all to actually implementing all the requirements. So there's great resources.
Colonel,
Yes.
To your background and what you're working on right now, what do you see as the greatest threats in the space? We talked a little bit earlier around we don't ask companies to protect themselves in any other domain than cyber. In land, air, space, sea, we don't expect companies to protect themselves. Cyber is a different domain, and I know we talked a little bit about authorities, but as you look from where you sit, and you touched on this a little bit in your intro, what are the greatest threats in this space right now?
So on my Title 10 side, nation-state actors are my biggest threat. As an intel professional, I look at that, all domains. This is just a new domain. They're attacking in the air, on the land, in space, and now in cyber. I look at it very much the same. On the securing the country here as a National Guard member, it's operating in that environment, and this is crazy, it's protecting my mission. So I take the environment that we're in and know that I'm gonna probably be working in an untrustworthy environment. How can I mitigate what I push into that environment before we give it to whoever's saving someone in a hurricane? And then on the backside, how do we ensure that everyone knows this went out there, how can we stop that mitigation? So it's knowing that I'm in a trustworthy environment is probably the first thing that we were gonna say, because if we secure it too much, we're gonna save lives. We are gonna go use something that is gonna let it out there, but for the interest of saving lives. So that's probably my biggest threat, is to the mission of that, but we'll still do it.
And your current authorities are based on this the historical domains of land, air, space, and sea. How do you handle the boundaryless threat of cybersecurity with the authorities that are more rigid? So you have this very agile threat, but you have authorities that are much more defined. And so how do you work with your industrial partners in that environment?
That's a very interesting question. So going through, and I'll just stick to the National Guard side, we have 3 types of authorities. My Title 10 means I'm just like an Air Force person. Title 32 is state active duty. And then state active duty, or Title 32 is usually at the state, and it's supporting the state. There's SAD, or state active duty, that is under the governor. The governor can say to his guardsmen, thou shalt, and this is what you do. In those authorities, we have more maneuver space to work in cyber. So for example, Texas, during their malware, or right now, Louisiana declared a cyber state of emergency so they can call up their guardsmen prior to something happening to protect elections. So what's unfortunate is that we need indications and warnings that this is gonna happen so we can call those people up, because I can't just put my state active duty hat on, take it off, and put my Title 10 hat on. That's kind of illegal. So unfortunately, those processes are way too slow for the speed of cyber. My indications and warnings of somebody launching a missile on us is this big. My indications and warnings of somebody doing a land attack is this big. My cyber is this much. And so I don't have the time to go, okay, I need folks in certain states to posture to start protecting the state. One other thing we try to do with these crazy authorities is we've got cyber ISR professionals that are trying to look for those indications and warnings. So as you look at all those ransomware attacks that we were talking about, each state says, okay, it's local. Each state is dealing with them separately. We look at holistically and say, this is an indication and warning. What I see here is an enemy that might be trying to work toward a 2020 election. Where are my holes in these systems? But nobody's putting it all together. So we hope to put that all together so we can protect the environment in the 2020. So unfortunately, those authorities, we're dancing around them. We're totally legal, but we have to figure out where we can play. And without the governor saying yes, and without the president declaring an emergency, there's certain things we just can't do. But we can keep an eye on it and hopefully deal with the indications and warnings and develop those in the beginning.
A question to both of you. One of the things as we look at advances in security, we talk about the agility of the cyber threat, but one of the other pieces to this, it means that we have a lot more cross-sector engagement. And so in the past, we've looked each sector knows its sector all the way down. But where the advantage comes to engagement with government is in that cross-sector information sharing when it comes to nation-state activity. And without going into the nation-state activity piece of it, what are you seeing from a positive side as far as how industry is working across sectors? Because with the ISAC structure, with the ISAO structure, we have traditionally focused very much on sector by sector, which certainly has a role. But again, as we see this threat evolve, and we saw DHS look at this with the National Risk Management Center last year, and these efforts, what are some of the advantages or efforts that you're seeing underway that you think are positive from a cross-sector perspective? Vicki, I can start with you.
Yeah, so obviously the stand-up of CISA, the new DHS organization, is an effort to bring a more fulsome approach to cybersecurity. And DHS also has oversight of several of the sectors, more than half of the sectors. So it becomes more interesting when you look at the silos that still exist. I mean, obviously, DoD is the sector-specific agency for the defense industrial base, and that's not going to change anytime soon. We have that special relationship with the DIB. Similarly, DOE has with the energy sector. But what we do on the backside is that across the government, there's quite a bit of information sharing across the sector or across the federal agencies, and specifically in the federal cyber centers. DoD has 3 of the 6 federal cyber centers, and so they're bringing in information from the DoD perspective, as are the other sectors that have centers, and sharing that information with DHS and with the CISA organization, and trying to create that picture. So there has been a lot of effort going on within CISA to do more outreach, and DHS is absolutely supportive of anything that we have asked for in terms of how can they help the defense industrial base, and I know that that's true across all the sectors. They've got a number of services that they offer, and we have been working with them to take advantage of that.
Colonel?
So I'll speak to a couple states that are doing some pilot programs where states themselves, under the governor's auspice, so we're under state active duty, have worked with public-private sector to bring them all together into the state to just look at their critical infrastructure that they need to protect. We've not implemented it throughout the country yet, but that, as the National Guard Bureau, that's our job, is to try to get the authorities to implement that. But because as DHS looks at it, there's sometimes a level below that local level that just doesn't get looked at, and we are trying to focus more on that local, lower level to ensure those states have the support.
And as a follow-on to that, because what you've both touched on, and would again like to get both of your responses to this, government does response really well. When something happens, we are able to galvanize forces and work incredibly efficiently. While tragic, the best examples are sort of post 9/11, post Katrina, and how we came together. Even things like Obamacare, which failed at the first run, but then in 60 days it was stood up. We have these examples of when we need to bring the forces together following a crisis, we can do that really well. The challenge, though, is what can we be doing before an event? I know, Colonel, you talked left of boom, that pre-event planning. And so curious to know from each of you the efforts that you have underway, both cross-sector and with the DIB, to look at what is that planning that we can do more effectively to prevent and to be resilient. Because it isn't just about prevention. I don't always think an event doesn't have to be a demonstration of failure if you're prepared all the way through the cycle, through recovery. So what are some of those pre-event and preparedness efforts that you have underway?
Well, certainly for preparedness, we were going to look at making sure that cyber hygiene and best practices are in place across the defense industrial base, as well as the Department of Defense. There was a comment earlier about the Petya example, where Maersk did not have their incident recovery plans available. And that's one of the things that we talk about all the time with our defense industrial base partners is, it's great to have a cyber incident response plan, but if it's only on the network that you've just now lost your access to, you have a big problem. So make sure that you printed it somewhere along the line. I think that having exercises, things like Cyberstorm, which is a DHS exercise, helps us get into that mindset of how can we work better together and how can we work with our industry partners. So those are things that you can do in advance of. And it's really, I'd encourage any business, small or big, to look at, running through what those scenarios are. What would you do if you had these, and who do you need to call? Who are those contacts? Do you have a lawyer handy? Do you have an incident response team? What are you going to do when you have malware? How do you operate in those spaces? So I think some of that is really good to have that thought. I'd also say that there's also the National Cyber Strategy that's being implemented right now, and that is looking overall at things that can be done across the federal government space in improving cybersecurity. So I think there's the first line of defense really is that basic hygiene, and then planning forward, following some of the NIST guidelines as well.
It's the old phrase, you don't want to be exchanging business cards during the event.
Exactly.
Looking forward. Colonel?
So I spoke to the ISR piece that the Intel folks are looking for indications and warnings. One thing we also do with that is the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. We feed some of that information into there so they can develop AI algorithms. So quite possibly those indications and warnings could be developed into an algorithm that we could see it earlier. And on separately, good thing that you've covered the exercises. We do a guard exercise called Cyber Shield, where we take the same exercise and put it at the more local level so we can play down in the states and get the cyber folks, both the cyber and the intelligence folks working together to develop the plan, the before and then the reactive plan.
So you mentioned cyber hygiene, Vicki, and I think it's a great, there was a period of time in government when we pushed back on that term because people felt like it was offensive because, well, we're not going to not do this, the basics. We now recognize that the basics aren't being done, and we've got to do a lot more.
That's right.
But there's this very interesting metaphor when it comes to the human around the metaphor to the healthcare industry. So I recently read that 91% of all chronic illnesses can actually be prevented with appropriate behaviors. And it's not, I don't think it's coincidental that the statistic that we all know is 91% of breaches to industry tend to happen through phishing, which is very much based on human social engineering, as we know. So as we look at, we talk a lot about technology solutions, but at the end of the day, regardless of how much technology you have, if the human isn't educated, then you're not going to have the solutions. And when we were working on the commission a few years ago, we had this tension between moving security away from the end user and educating the end user. And we recognize that the balance really comes in that hybrid. You have to do both. You want to invest in the technology to move security away when you can, but you're never going to get humans out of the loop.
You're right.
And they're going to be a part of it. So in each of your respective roles, how are you focusing on educating individuals and creating these cultures of security, cultures of cyber readiness?
Well, in DoD, we have required training every year. You have to go through cyber awareness training. You're not allowed to have an account on the network and connect your first time until you've done your training. Obviously, that's fleeting. I mean, it's just a one-time experience per year. There are some of our DoD components that do things like challenge questions every day. So when you log into the computer, you have to answer that question. There are things like that. October is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so we've got a lot of campaigns to build up the workforce and make sure that they understand. But I think it's twofold. I think it's also the technology piece. So you want to train your people as best you can, and I'm known for evangelizing the don't click on the link, and oh, by the way, you may not see a link, you may see a box. Don't click on the box either. You have to start thinking about those kinds of things. But there's also the piece of it where you use the technology to your advantage. In DoD, I can't click on the link because it's disabled for me. So we've taken that step. And that's not the way that most business operates. So you do have to work a little harder to make sure your employees are paying attention. But we do take that step. So I don't even have to worry about it. I just know I can't do it. And I know why I can't do it. But I also know that that's hard to teach. So the next piece of that, obviously, is the mitigation. Is how quickly can you discover that you're now executing malware? How quickly can you contain it, and then do your recovery? So it's a whole package. You can't just rely only on the people or the technology. You also have to have your processes to recover.
I absolutely agree. One thing I would add is now, if I did it, if I was the bad person, I no longer feel like I need to hide it. I feel like I need to, the DoD says, open kimono, tell us what you did, give us all the information, and we will address it. It isn't, I don't feel malicious in that intent, and I think more people openly report when we screw up as humans.
I have a couple questions, but I do want to make sure that I give the audience a chance. And first, we'll do a quick round to see if anybody has any questions for our panelists before we ask a few others. This is great because I want to ask. Oh, yeah.
You mentioned, we're only strong as the weakest link, and you referenced the localities. I'm sorry, you referenced the localities being an issue. You talked about state of Texas compromised. I think it was 23 localities. Mm-hmm. The state was brought in as a part of an executive order, I believe, from the governor. So when we talk about preventative, a lot of these localities, they don't fall into the jurisdiction of the state. So they kind of can do their own thing, but when it comes back to them, they don't have funding. So if you look at the state of Wisconsin, I believe theirs is set up by volunteers. I think they got a small grant for a little bit. So this may not be something that falls under yours, but it looks at the preventative piece. A lot of these localities, they may have best practices of what to do. They don't have the funding. And is the federal government looking at providing funding for these localities, which are our weakest link, to be able to meet the minimum standards, to be able to protect the infrastructure? Because otherwise, a lot of them really can't do it, and we're waiting for that next incident where then the state can come in or the guard can come in and help, but by then it's too late.
So I don't have any insight into that. That would have been a good question for the DHS person. But I do know that there are a lot of places that are looking at things as cybersecurity as a service, so that those capabilities could be pooled for groups, and it could, obviously for local municipalities, that could work as well. But even at the federal government level, we're really trying to push more of a cybersecurity as a service kind of an offering that will help in some of those situations.
And I would, from the National Guard perspective, just like the couple states that we have doing some amazing indications work, as a pilot program, from the National Guard Bureau, what we do is go advocate for the authorities and possible funding for that. And we know how the government works. 2020 elections are coming up. If we can use that to levy the money. So we're advocating for it. If it's coming out, I don't know, but I can guarantee that's being advocated for.
It's a great question, too, because ransomware really highlighted that, I think, when we started to see that. And I had an initial position on it, which was, you know, shame on the states for not, in the cities, for not knowing that their vulnerabilities existed. And I had a conversation with a journalist who had done some investigation, and she said, well, no, actually, you have situations in these states where it's voluntary. You've got, you know, multiple CISOs across a state, and it's that they actually don't know. And so this is where I do think the federal government can come in to say, A, here are the patches that are out there, and that we should actually have more of a connection. And talking with Chris Krebs and talking about election security, 10,000 jurisdictions, that's a lot, right? And so if you think about each of those being vulnerable and not having that awareness, I do think that there are some opportunities, both with, I think it was legislation that Senator Warner presented around investment in security, to look at this more closely, because we can't expect the states, to the point even about industry, we can't expect everybody to know beyond what their sphere is, where the threats exist. And I think that we could do a lot more in that space. And so I think it's a great point now, particularly, as the Colonel says, we look to the 2020 elections.
I'd also like to see a lot more national level education, just public awareness. And I mean, I know there's different schools of thought on that, but 60 Minutes did a presentation several months ago that was amazing, and it was a way to get that information out to the public where people just don't think about it these days. But how many of you are using a second form of authentication for your banking? Your banks mostly offer it, but are you taking advantage of it? How secure is that when I get out my mobile phone and I do my banking online? You know, those kinds of things we need to start thinking about as human beings first, and also as government and industry.
Well, and you touch mobile security, I think, is one of this, you know, that's another, it's the monster that we won't talk about. Because, I mean, if you think about the fact that we put more information on our phones now than we ever have, and you have to do so much more, but we don't have the discipline with our phones the way we do with our work computers, even though the vulnerabilities there exist to a much greater degree. And now we start to see mobile phishing attempts and things like that. We have time for another question, or I can ask my, yes.
The manufacturer's responsibility for the various devices, because what you have basically now is it's like buying a house with no doors, or the doors are just, you know, somebody tied the doorknob or something. It's just, you figure your phones and your computers, I mean, most people aren't cyber experts. So if some of this was built into the hardware and the software, when you buy it, I think we would have less problems. And is anybody pushing the industry to take some responsibility for that?
So there are a lot of efforts underway to address the supply chain integrity. We've had some recent legislation that has actually prohibited DoD from acquiring capabilities or products that were from certain companies, Huawei being one, and ZTE and several others, as well as we are not allowed to buy Kaspersky products. And although those are very public, we have laws that tell us to do that. We've implemented that, and we've required that our defense contractors also not give us those type of products. It is a little bit spotty, however, how it's implemented, because a lot of it's based on, well, this legislation came out this year and this legislation came out next year. So we are working towards a more comprehensive plan, but it is a challenge. The other piece of that, though, is ensuring that when we contract and we establish our requirements for capabilities, that we include those cybersecurity requirements up front, and we let the contractors know that as you're developing capability for DoD, you must ensure that the integrity of that supply chain. There are more challenges, though, along with that, because there's a whole thing about supply chain illumination, and that the prime knows the next tier down, but doesn't necessarily know 4 tiers down. So you've got to make sure you're flowing down all those cybersecurity requirements throughout the supply chain. So it is a challenge, but it is something that we're definitely aware of, and we are working to at least to improve our overall approach to that supply chain.
Colonel, do you have any?
I have nothing to comment on.
Okay. Well, I want to thank both of you, both for your service, and one of the key elements to the success in this space is institutional knowledge and individuals with a level of expertise who have committed to this for so long. And so thank you for your service and the work that you're doing. And for this great discussion, I appreciate all of you and your time today. Thank you.
Very much.